The dust sheets came off in the third week of October, and beneath them, Eleanor Vane found a house that had been left to die. Greywater Hall stood at the end of a long, wet drive in Somerset. Its windows blind with grime, its great staircase furred gray, the morning room ceiling sagging where a winter of rain had found a way in. She had bought it for almost nothing, because almost nothing was what it appeared to be worth, and because the agent in Bath had said, with the particular kindness people reserve for women they expect to fail, that a lady alone would find such a project beyond her. She had smiled at him and signed the papers. Now she stood in the cold-flagged hall with a list in her hand and lime dust on her sleeve, and she did not yet know that the man whose name was carved above the door would come back to take it from her. She was 29, which the world had decided was a number past usefulness. A widow of 3 years, left with her late husband's debts and her own stubborn competence. She had learned to read a builder's estimate the way other women read a dance card. The men of the village called her the new woman at the hall when they were being polite, and the woman playing at squire when they were not, and Eleanor heard both, and let neither settle. Her husband had been a man of great charm and small reliability. A man who borrowed against tomorrow as easily as he poured a glass. And when the fever carried him off in his 34th year, he had left her a list of creditors longer than the list of mourners. She had sold her wedding silver to pay the worst of them, and the rest she had paid slowly, shilling by shilling, by taking in the accounts of shopkeepers too proud or too unlettered to keep their own. She had learned in those 3 years that a column of figures does not lie and does not flatter, and that there was a strange clean comfort in a thing that simply added up. Greywater Hall had added up. Ruined as it was, the bones of it were sound, the roof timbers black oak and true under the rot, and she had walked its damp rooms with a candle on the day of the sale and felt the old certainty rise in her, the certainty that here was a broken thing that could be mended by someone who did not flinch from the breaking. If you have ever stood in a ruined room and seen before anyone else could exactly what it might become, then you already know something of her. She saw the morning room finished before she had swept its floor. What she did not know that first gray week was that 200 miles north a man was reading a letter that named Greywater Hall as part of an estate he had believed lost, and that the reading of it had made his hands go still. The house had belonged to the Marwoods for 4 generations, and the last of them, Captain Julian Marwood, had not seen it since he was 19. His father had gambled the place into the hands of creditors, sold it under a false name to settle a private shame, and then died before he could tell his son what had been done. Julian had spent 8 years in the peninsula and come home a captain with a scar through his left brow and a silence where his easy youth had been, and he had come home to nothing. The solicitors had unwound the false sale slowly, as solicitors do, and by the time the title was clear again, the house had passed through 3 hands and landed with a widow from Bath who, the steward reported, was tearing the place apart. He rode down through the last of the autumn with that report folded in his coat. He did not ride ahead. A man who has had a thing taken does not announce himself to the person holding it. He arrives and he watches their face. So it was that on a Tuesday, in late October, with the rain just stopping and the drive a ribbon of wet gravel, Eleanor came out onto the front steps to scold a carter, and found instead a tall man on a dark horse, his navy coat soaked black at the shoulders, looking up at the house as though it had struck him. Stay with me, because what happened on those steps is the whole story in miniature, and neither of them understood it yet. He dismounted without asking leave. He stood in her courtyard, rainwater running off the brim of his hat, and he looked not at her but at the lintel above the door, where a name had been cut into the stone before he was born. Eleanor followed his gaze, and then brought it back to him, and something in her chest tightened that she chose to call irritation. "You are trespassing," she said. "This is private land." "I am aware of whose land it is," he answered, and his voice was low and level, the voice of a man who had given orders to frighten men under fire, and learned never to raise it. "I have come a long way to see it. Then you may see it from the gate." She did not move from the top of the step. Her plain gray gown was wet at the hem, and her hands were rough from a month of work, and she was acutely, furiously aware that he had looked at the house with more tenderness than he had yet spared for her. "We are not receiving." He looked at her then properly, and she watched him take in the lime dust, the list, the chapped knuckles, and rearrange whatever he had expected into something he had not. "You are the widow," he said. It was not a question. The word landed the way it always landed. Flat and final. A small coffin of a word. The widow from Bath. The woman playing at squire. He did not sneer it. That was somehow worse. "I am Mrs. Vane," she said. "And you have not given me your name, Marwood," he said. "Julian Marwood. My family built this house." The rain had truly stopped now. Somewhere behind her, a workman dropped a length of timber and swore, and a thrush sang in the dripping hedge as though nothing in the world had changed. Eleanor heard her own pulse in her throat. She had bought the house clear. She had the papers. She had stood in the solicitor's office in Bath and watched the seal pressed into the wax. And yet she knew, looking at this soaked and silent man who could not stop staring at the stone above her door, that something was about to be very wrong with all of it. "You had better come inside, Captain Marwood," she said, "before you take a chill on my steps." He came inside. That was the first command she gave him, though neither of them named it so, and he obeyed it because he was cold, and because he wanted more than he would have admitted to be under that roof again. The morning room was the only finished space, and she took him there because it was warm, and because she would not show a stranger the rest until she understood him. A fire burned in a grate she had reblacked herself. New plaster, still pale, ran clean lines where the sagging ceiling had been. A worn carpet she had bought at auction lay over the boards, and on the mantel stood a small brass clock that did not work, and a chipped blue jug holding the last of the season's chrysanthemums. He stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, and she saw his throat move. "There was a paper rose here," he said at last. "On this wall. My mother chose it. Yellow with a green stripe." "There was," Eleanor said carefully. "It came off in long ribbons. The damp had rotted it through." She did not tell him she had kept a square of it, pressed flat in a drawer, because it had been too pretty to throw entirely away. She did not know why she kept it. She knew only that she had. He said nothing for a while. Then he asked in that level voice how much she had paid, and when she told him he was quiet again, doing arithmetic behind his scarred brow, and she understood that the sum was both more than the house had been sold for in shame, and less than it had once been worth, and that he was a man caught between two injuries. "The sale was false," he said. "My father sold it under a name that was not his, to hide what he had done. The courts have unwound it. The title is clear again, Mrs. Vane, and it is mine." "I have papers," she said. "So do I." They stood on either side of her new carpet, two people each holding a true thing, and the fire snapped between them. It is one of the cruelties of the law that two honest claims can stand in the same room and only one can win. Eleanor had learned, in 3 years of widowhood, that the world did not arrange itself for her convenience. Yet she had also learned that she did not fall down merely because she had been pushed. "You will want somewhere to stay tonight," she said. "The inn at Coombe is 4 miles back, and the road is bad in the dark. There is a dry room above the stable. It is yours, if you want it, while the solicitors argue. I will not have it said that I turned a soldier into the rain over a quarrel that lawyers made." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he said. "Because it is the decent thing," she said, "and because if you sleep in my stable you cannot say I hid the house from you. Look at all of it. Then we will both know what we are fighting over." It was, she would think later, the most foolish offer she had ever made. It was also the one that decided everything. He stayed. The solicitors wrote their slow letters back and forth between Bath and London, and the question of who owned Greywater Hall hung unanswered through the back end of autumn. And in the meantime, two people who were supposed to be enemies found themselves living within 100 yards of one another in a house that was being born again under one of their hands. Eleanor worked. That was who she was, and the arrival of a dispossessed captain did not change it. She was up before the light, and she carried buckets, and she argued with the plasterer about lime, and she climbed a ladder in the long gallery to wash 4 generations of soot from a row of ancestral portraits she did not yet know were his. Julian watched her from doorways. He told himself he watched because the house was his, and he had a right to see what was done to it, and for a while he believed himself. He saw her crouch in the cold nursery to mend a child's broken hobby horse, a poor wooden thing left behind by some long-departed family, its painted mane half gone, and one rocker split clean through. She had no child to mend it for, and she knew it, and she mended it anyway, fitting the split wood with glue and a strip of leather, and a patience he had not seen in a person since the war. And when it was done, she set it in the window where the light would fall on it, and stood looking at it for a moment as though it were a thing that mattered. He did not understand why his throat tightened at the sight. He saw, too, the night the stable lad took a fever. The boy was 9. An orphan kept on for odd work in his keep, and when the chill went to his chest, there was no one in the house whose business he was. Eleanor made him hers. She carried her own dinner up to the loft, untouched, and fed it to him in spoonfuls, and she sat on an upturned pail beside his pallet through the worst of the night, and Julian, unable to sleep, came down into the yard and heard her voice through the boards above, low and even. Reading the boy a story about a fox and a crow from a child's primer, she must have carried in her own box of things. He stood in the passage outside that door and did not go in. He listened to a woman who owed the boy nothing, spend her sleep on him for no reward that any ledger would ever record, and something in him that had been clenched for 8 years loosened a single notch, and he was afraid of it. The village had its verdict ready. In the taproom of the Coombe Inn, where Julian went one evening to escape the strange ache of the house, he heard it delivered whole. The room was low and warm and thick with pipe smoke, and he took a settle in the corner where the firelight did not reach, a stranger in a plain coat, whom no one marked. "The widow at the Hall," said a red-faced farmer to his neighbor, not knowing who listened. "Playing at being gentry with money that isn't hers to spend. She'll run it into the ground and be gone by spring, and good riddance. A woman alone has no business with a house like that." The neighbor laughed and said he'd give her till the thaw. Julian set down his glass very carefully, paid for what he had not finished, and walked the 4 miles back in the dark rather than hear another word, and the whole wet way home. He turned it over and could not say why the farmer's contempt had felt like a stone thrown at his own window. He found to his discomfort that he had begun to look for her. A house is a large thing. A man can arrange to be where another person is without seeming to try. He carried the heavy auction lots up the stairs because she would otherwise have done it herself, and he learned the rhythm of her days the way he had once learned the ground before a march where she would be at dawn and where at noon, and which rooms she saved for the failing light. He held the ladder in the gallery, his hand a careful inch from the small of her back, ready and not touching, while she reached the high portraits. He took to splitting the morning kindling before she rose, so that the first thing she found each day was a fire already laid, and when she asked the housemaid who had done it, the girl only shrugged, and Eleanor looked across the yard at the stable loft and said nothing. Once when she came down faint, with the heat of the work and the height, he put a hand under her elbow without thinking and said, "Sit. Eat something. You have not eaten since dawn." She sat. She ate the bread he put into her hand, and he stood over her until she had finished it, the way a man stands who will not be argued with. She told herself she obeyed, because she was tired, and she did not look at the place on her arm where his fingers had been, because it was still warm there and she did not trust what the warmth meant. There is a kind of attention that asks nothing, and Eleanor, who had been married to a charming man who took and took, did not at first recognize it as attention at all. She thought him cold. She catalogued his silences as disapproval. When he carried the lumber, she decided he was proving the house was his. When he steadied her on the ladder, she decided he wished her gone from it before she fell and cost him a lawsuit. Her wound told her these things in a reasonable voice, and she believed her wound because it had never yet been wrong about a man. The truth of him came out on a night in November, and it came out because of the portrait. She had cleaned it last in the row, a small, dark canvas in the gallery's corner, and under her cloth a face had emerged that was not an ancestor. It was a young woman, fair, laughing, painted with the carelessness of love rather than the stiffness of commission. Eleanor was holding a candle up to it, trying to read the brass plate, when Julian came into the gallery and saw what she was looking at, and went perfectly still in the doorway. "That is not a Marwood," she said. "No." He crossed the floor slowly. In the candlelight, the scar through his brow was a pale seam. Her name was Anne. We were to be married. The spring, I came home. I had been away too long, and I thought there was no hurry. I went back for 1 season more because the Colonel asked it, and because I was proud of the asking. He stopped. He had not, Eleanor would later understand, said any of this aloud to a living person before. There was a fever in the village that winter. She nursed in the cottages because no one else would. And she took it, and she died in the October. And I was in Spain, and did not know for 6 weeks. I came home to bury a stone with her name on it. I had her likeness painted from a sketch. I could not bear to hang it, and I could not bear to burn it, so it went into the dark with the rest of what my father ruined. The fire of her candle trembled because her hand had begun to shake. She set it down. "You loved her," she said. "I failed her," he said, level as ever, "and that was the wound. Named once, and never again. Not the dead girl, but his belief that a better man, a man who had not gone back for 1 season more, would have been there. He had built his coldness over that belief, the way she had laid new plaster over rot. And they both knew, standing in the gallery, that plaster does not heal what is under it. It only holds the shape. If this is the part where you have begun to hope, let yourself. Press whatever you press to say you are listening. Then come back, because the world was not finished with either of them. After the gallery, the distance between them changed its quality. They did not speak of Anne again, but the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people who had each seen the other's hidden room. He began without ceremony to help with the house, as though it were a thing they were making, rather than a thing they were fighting over. He knew where the old well had been and the trick of the kitchen chimney that had defeated 3 sweeps, and which of the great oaks in the park his grandfather had planted, and which had seeded themselves since. He told her how the long gallery had looked lit for a ball when he was a boy. The candles doubled in the dark windows, and she found that she could see it as he spoke. One gray afternoon he showed her the mark cut low on the morning room door frame where his mother had measured his height each birthday, a ladder of small notches stopping at the year he went away, and Eleanor knelt to look at it and did not trust herself to speak. She listened, and she used what he told her. The chimney swept his way at last and drawing clean, and the house that rose under their 4 hands was neither hers alone nor his memory restored, but some third thing, new, that had needed both of them to exist. It could not last, of course. Houses in this part of the world come with families attached, and the Marwoods had a dowager. Lady Constance Marwood, Julian's great-aunt, descended upon Greywater Hall in the first week of December in a traveling coach with a footman and a maid, and a quantity of luggage that announced she did not mean to leave quickly. She had heard that her great-nephew, the rightful heir, was living in a stable while a tradesman's widow occupied the family seat, and she had come to set the natural order to rights. She came into the morning room ahead of her maid, drawing off her traveling gloves a finger at a time, and her eyes went round the room once swiftly, taking its measure. They paused on the new plaster, on the worn auction carpet, on the chipped blue jug, and Eleanor watched the old woman price each thing and find it wanting and decide, in the space of 3 breaths, exactly who, its mistress, must be. She was 70, and upright, and her gloved hands were never still, and she looked at Eleanor's lime-dusted gown and roughened hands across the morning room, and arranged her face into perfect courtesy. "How resourceful you have been, Mrs. Dray. Vain," she said, "to keep the place from falling down until its family could return to it. I am sure Julian is most grateful. We shall of course see that you are not left out of pocket for your trouble." She had reduced a year of Eleanor's life to the labor of a useful servant, and she had done it without raising her voice. And the rival she had brought with her sat by the fire and smiled. The rival's name was Miss Sophia Crail, and she was 23 and golden, and the daughter of a family whose land marched with the Marwood acres. And Lady Constance had selected her for Julian the way one selects a curtain to match a wall. Sophia played the pianoforte beautifully, and said charming things, and looked at Julian with the confidence of a woman who has been told her whole life that she is the correct choice. She looked at Eleanor exactly once, took in everything, and dismissed it. "I think it is so brave," she said sweetly to the room. "For a woman to attempt a man's work, one does so admire the attempt." The dowager's fan paused at precisely the right height. Eleanor felt the heat climb her throat and kept her hands folded, and her voice even. And across the room she saw Julian's jaw set like carved stone, though he said nothing, because there was nothing yet that could be said. December tightened around the house. Lady Constance was patient and relentless. She produced through a London solicitor of her own an argument that strengthened Julian's claim and dissolved Eleanor's almost entirely. For the false sale being void, the widow had bought a thing the seller had no right to sell, and her papers, however honestly obtained, were papers for nothing. The law, it appeared, agreed. Eleanor sat in the morning room with the letter in her hand and read it 3 times and felt the floor she had relaid tilt under her. "You will be compensated naturally," Lady Constance said. She had come to deliver the news herself, which was its own small cruelty. "The sum you paid, returned in full, with something added for your labor. It is more than generous. You may be gone by Christmas and take the credit for a charitable winter's work." She paused at the door, and could not in the end resist the third voicing of the thing the whole county had decided. It was always too much house for a woman alone. Surely you see that now. Eleanor saw nothing that night but the chrysanthemum jug on the mantel and the firelight on the new plaster and the long gallery full of someone else's family. She had done what she always did. She had taken a ruined thing and given it her hands and her sleeplessness and her belief, and the world had waited until the work was beautiful, and then come to take it from her. She sat very still in the dark, while the fire sank to a red glow, and she let herself, just for a little while, feel the full size of it. She had relaid the floor beneath her own feet, board by board. She had scraped the rot from the morning room ceiling, and watched the new plaster go up, white and clean. She had stood on the ladder in the gallery with her arms aching, and made another woman's ancestors visible again out of the soot, not knowing they were not hers to make visible. Every nail in the place knew her hands, and it would all be signed away by a dry man in Bath who had never carried a bucket up those stairs in his life. She understood, sitting alone while the fire died, that she had also given the house something she had not intended to give it, and that the something had his scarred brow and level voice, and that this was the worst loss, because no court would ever hear of it, and no compensation would touch it. She did not weep. She had taught herself not to, in 3 years of learning that tears mended nothing, and were seen by no one who would help. She folded the letter and set it under the broken clock, and she began in the cold to make a list of what she would take and what she would leave. What she did not know was that Julian had been handed the same letter an hour earlier by his great-aunt, who had expected him to be glad, and that he had read it standing in the stable-yard in the dark and had not been glad at all. He came to find her near midnight. She was in the gallery, taking the small dark portrait of Anne down from the wall to leave it where it belonged, and he stood in the doorway and watched her lift another woman's likeness with careful hands, the woman who was costing her everything, and he understood several things at once, the way a man understands them only when he is about to lose the chance to act on them. "Leave it," he said. "It can stay. You hung it straight." Then, after a silence, "They tell me the house is mine." "It is," Eleanor said. She did not turn around. "Congratulations, Captain Marwood. You have it back. I have kept it warm for you." Her voice did not break, which cost her a great deal. "Look at me," he said. She did not. "Eleanor, look at me." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice turned her around, as no command could have. "I have spent 8 years," he said, "believing that the way to keep a thing safe was to stand far enough away that I could not fail it again. I stood away from this house. I stood away from you. And I have watched you, every day, walk straight at the broken thing and put your hands on it without once asking whether it was safe. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I am done standing in doorways." "You are confused," she said, "because I mended your house. You mended a great deal more than the house," he said, "and you know it, and so do I." She told him to go to bed. He went, because she asked it. Still, the distance had a different quality again, and neither of them slept. The reckoning came on the day Lady Constance had appointed for the family's formal return, a day she had made into a small public ceremony, because she understood that a verdict delivered before witnesses cannot easily be unsaid. She had invited the neighboring families to dine, and to see the heir restored to his seat, and the golden Miss Crail installed beside him, and she had invited them into the long gallery for the announcing of it, beneath the rows of Marwood faces, in the very room where Eleanor had washed the soot from his ancestors with her own raw hands. Eleanor had meant to be gone before they came. The carrier had been engaged for the morning. Yet the morning's rain had swollen the ford, and the cart could not get through until the afternoon. And so she was still in the house in her gray gown, packing the last of her tools in the morning room. When the carriages came up the drive and the gallery filled with candlelight and silk and the low roar of people who all knew the story and had all decided how it ended, Lady Constance rose to speak. She had Julian at her right hand and Sophia at her left, golden and pale blue, and the assembled county arranged itself to watch the natural order confirm itself. She thanked them for coming to mark the return of Greywater Hall to its family. She spoke of duty and of blood and of the proper care of great houses. And she was turning with a small gesture to draw Miss Crail forward into the place that had been chosen for her when Julian set down his glass and crossed the gallery. He crossed it in front of all of them, past the dowager's outstretched hand, past the rival in her pale blue silk, the length of the room his grandfather's portraits watched over, and he did not stop until he reached the door of the morning room, where Eleanor stood in her gray gown, with a hammer in her hand and her face white, having heard the whole of it through the open door. The gallery had gone entirely silent. A footman froze with a decanter half lifted. Lady Constance's fan stopped at last in the air. "This house is hers," Julian said. Not loudly. He did not need to. "I mean to marry her." For the length of a held breath, nobody moved. Then the brittle architecture of the afternoon came down without a single sound, the way a thing comes down when the one beam holding it is pulled. Lady Constance's hand found the back of a chair. Her mouth opened and shut, and produced, at last, only her great-nephew's name, twice smaller, each time. Sophia's smile held for a moment longer than her eyes did, and then she looked for the first time, simply young, and turned her face away to spare herself being watched. And the county, which had come to witness one thing and was witnessing another, did what crowds do when the moral weather changes. An old woman near the window, who had nursed in the same fever winter that took Anne, said clearly into the silence that she, for one, had always thought the new Mrs. Nettis vain a credit to the place. And another voice agreed, and the room began slowly to rearrange its verdict. Eleanor did not hear most of it. She heard the 4 words, and then she heard nothing but her own blood. The hammer was still in her hand. She set it down on the windowsill with great care, because she did not trust herself to hold anything. And she looked up at the man who had crossed a room full of his own people to stand in a servant's doorway, and she found that her practiced composure had finally, completely failed her. "You cannot marry me to keep me from being put out of the house," she said. "I am not," he said. "I am marrying you because I have stood in doorways my whole life, and you are the first thing I have ever wanted to walk through one for." He looked down at her rough hands and took them in his. Lime dust and all in front of the entire county. And that touch, the first he had allowed himself, said more than the speech the dowager would have had him make. "Marry me, Eleanor. And the rest of it with me." The dowager's solicitor, a dry, small man who had come prepared to seal one outcome, was prevailed upon that same evening to seal another, and so the reversal was made not only in feeling but in fact, the settlement drawn so that the house could not be taken from her whatever befell, the procedure sealing what the heart had already decided. Lady Constance, who was confidently wrong but not in the end a monster, sat very upright through it all, and somewhere in the long evening, watching her great-nephew's face as he looked at the widow from Bath, she recognized something she had not had the words for, and grew quiet, and later, she would be the one to teach Eleanor the trick of the morning-room fire. That was for the spring. That night, when the carriages had gone and the candles had burned low, the two of them stood in the morning-room that was the first finished thing, and now would not be the last. The fire she had had reblacked with her own hands threw its light on the new plaster and the worn auction carpet, and the chipped blue jug with its dead chrysanthemums she had not yet had the heart to throw out. Snow had begun the first of the winter, settling soft against the dark windows she had washed until they were clear. Eleanor went to the drawer where she kept her small private things, and she took out the square of paper she had saved, the yellow rose with the green stripe that his mother had chosen, pressed flat all these weeks for a reason she had not let herself name. She put it into his hand without a word. He looked at it for a long time, this scrap of the house his father had ruined and his mother had loved, and a stranger had thought too pretty to throw away. And then he closed his scarred fingers around it, and he drew her in against his soaked no longer coat. And outside the snow came down over the park his grandfather had planted, and the roof she had made. Sounded the long drive, where he had ridden in out of the rain to reclaim what was his, not knowing he would find the one thing he had not known he was missing, standing on the steps in a gray gown. The house had been left to die. A woman the world had counted out, had put her hands on it and made it live, and the man who came to take it from her had stayed instead, and become its home alongside her, and that, in the end, was the only reclaiming that mattered. Thank you for staying with Eleanor and Julian to the end. If their winter warmed yours, leave a word, and tell me where you felt it turn.